denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a car parked outside of a sleazy motel, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, make sure you have a nice tall drink filled to the brim with refreshing ice. You'll need it for this story. Do you have any travel quirks? A particular item you must take with you, or a ritual you perform before you can get comfortable in a hotel? The grandfather in our story tonight has a very particular quirk. He must fill up the ice bucket in his motel room before he can sleep there. In fact, he's so adamant about it that one starts to wonder if there's some deeper underlying reason for this ritual. Perhaps it has to do with a cold and perfumed breeze that drifts through the hallways deep into the night. This story is called My Grandfather Always Filled the Ice Bucket Whenever He Stayed at a Motel. I recently learned why, and was written by C.B. Jones. Back when my parents were trying to make it work, back when they had their weekly meetings to help try and get along, before the separate apartments and holidays, and well before the divorce dust had all settled, they sent me to stay with my grandpa for the summer. He was a quiet man, my grandpa, and this kept me from being closer to him than I ought to have, especially since I was his only grandson. So when I discovered I'd have to spend an extended stretch of summer with him, I was less than thrilled. Everything distills down to a single week in July. That week, we were spending a lot of time in cemeteries all across northwestern Arkansas and parts of Missouri, taking winding roads through the back corners of the Ozark Mountains. At the time, with my 12-year-old frame of reference, I thought maybe we were doing this because Grandpa was close to the grave himself. Grandma had died a couple of years earlier, after all. But looking back and doing the math, that couldn't have been it. He had quite a ways to go still. What we were doing was chasing ghosts, more or less. Remnants of ancestors. We'd pull into a graveyard in the middle of nowhere, markers 100 years old, and he'd pull out his little notebook, thumb through the pages. Then he'd step out and with his hands on his hips give the plot of land a good look-see. Really survey the place. "Oh, that's not it," he'd mutter to himself, then get his bearings again. We would crisscross the rows of graves until he found the desired headstone. Then he'd pull out a piece of butcher paper and a disc of black rubbing wax. Using these tools, he'd make a rubbing of the grave, the imperfections and engravings etched onto the paper. This whole journey wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. I yearned for my usual summer routine of sleepovers, swimming pools, bicycles, fireworks, and movies with friends. But I tried to be on my best behavior and act gracious, even though I was quietly going insane with boredom. After stopping at a couple more nondescript cemeteries, we found ourselves at the end of the day. We headed back east, the blue evening and the twilight haze and the disappearing sun at our backs. "Gonna find us a place to stop off for the night." It would be our 5th overnight of the trip. I had lucked out once, and only once, when we found a place with a swimming pool, but it was near the interstate. That perk seemed unlikely out here in the country, running through small towns on 2-lane highways. We pulled up to a joint called the Huckleberry Inn, a park-by-the-door motel with a couple strips of single-story rooms all in a row. It looked plenty vacant. I waited in the car while Grandpa went to the front office and paid for a room. He returned to the car with a keychain, and we crept around to our room, unloaded our luggage. I belly flopped onto the bed. The stiff comforter felt like dead skin, and the mattress was lumpy. I found the remote to the TV and flicked through some channels. I wanted to watch MTV or Nickelodeon or something, but I felt too self-conscious to watch something like that with my grandpa here. Instead, I left it on an episode of Bonanza while I took a comic book to the bathroom for a bit. After I finished, I wandered off outside to find my grandpa. He was just standing in the parking lot, staring out into the dark and smoking a cigarette. He heard me come up behind him, turned to me. "You get the ice?" "Not yet," I said. It had become a ritual. No matter where we stopped on this trip, there was always a bucket of ice that we filled from the Motel ice machines. It didn't matter if neither of us opened the individually wrapped plastic cups and helped us to a glass of tap water on the rocks. It didn't matter if we just had dinner and weren't thirsty. No matter the situation, we had to fill the little plastic tub full of ice and leave it on the plastic tray atop the dresser until morning came, until it was nothing but a flimsy bag of cold water. I headed to where the ice and vending machines were, in a little alcove between the rooms and the motel office. The Pepsi machine gave off an ethereal glow. I pressed all the buttons and checked the change slot. Such habits could yield treasures like a free soda or 50 cents, but I came up empty that night. The ice machine whirred and groaned as I tried to get it to dispense. I bumped it with my shoulder, looked up into the little dispenser hole, even snaked my hand up there to see if I could feel the cold. Nothing. I shrugged and went back to the room with an empty bucket. Grandpa was lying on his back with his shoes off, twitching his toes through his socks. His eyes were half closed. I set the empty ice bucket down. "Get her filled up?" he asked. "Nah, machine was busted." He sat up with a start. "What? So there's no ice? Was there another machine?" He swung his legs off the bed and started lacing up his boots. "I don't think so." I didn't see what the big deal was. I'd never seen him rise above his emotionally flat baseline, and here he was getting worried about ice. "Come on, let's go see," he said. We did a perimeter sweep of the property, just a boy and his grandpa and a plastic bucket. His pace quickened the further we went. You wouldn't say his behavior was frantic if you saw him, but knowing him, that was the word that came to mind. His version of frantic was anybody else's calm mood. At the front office, we rang the service bell, rousing the owner from some back room. The overhead lights glinted off of her glasses as she greeted us with sleepy eyes and a tired smile. "Excuse me, y'all's ice machine's broke. You got another somewhere?" "No, I'm sorry. Supposed to have a repairman look at it next week, but I guess that don't help you now." There was a sympathetic smile. Fake. "You got anything in the back?" Grandpa asked, looking over her shoulder. "No, unfortunately," she said, with a little frown that tried to cover up the fact that she couldn't care less whether we had ice tonight. "There a convenience store around here?" Grandpa's mouth got smaller by a few millimeters. "Up the road, but... Oh, wait, what time is it?" "Nah, they're closed. I'm really sorry to inconvenience you folks like this." Grandpa made a little clicking noise. "We're gonna head out. Any way we can get a refund?" "On account of the ice machine? Jeez, you fellas must really like ice. I don't know if I can do that. Did y'all step foot in the room? Lie on the beds? It's not like there's a sign out front that says ice guaranteed. Look, we didn't even... Whatever, forget it. Keep it. Come on, Daniel, he said, halfway out the door. I could only glance back at the front desk lady's perplexed face. Grandpa was already halfway across the parking lot, marching with purpose. Here you go, I said, handing the front desk lady the plastic ice bucket. Look, you guys ever come back through, I promise we'll have it fixed. We've been trying to get the guy in here for weeks. I only shrugged and jogged after Grandpa. Get your bag. We gotta get out of here. It's important. He had already loaded his small suitcase in the trunk, and I went and grabbed mine. I had a nervous feeling in my stomach. For the life of me, I didn't know what was going on. I had never seen him the slightest bit rattled, but there he was, rattled. But I'd forgotten my comic in the restroom. I went back to grab it and pondered taking a leak for the road. God damn it, Daniel, hurry up! Grandpa yelled from the doorway. I had never heard him curse before, and he had never yelled at me either. My body flushed with shame and anger, and I ducked my head and sat in the front seat of the Sable, comic book in hand. He peeled out of the parking lot, and we drove off in haste. Whatever he thought was chasing us was still out there in the night. I didn't talk, and he didn't talk. Still feeling like a scolded puppy from him yelling at me, an anger simmered underneath and took over. My wounded pride took precedence over the burning questions I had. Primarily, just what in the hell was going on? There was close to an hour of driving. The forest around us, frightening and imposing in the dark, like it was something that wasn't meant to be traversed at this hour. It triggered a primal fear. The fear was this. There were things out here that could kill you, things that could drag you kicking and screaming out into the dark, never to be heard from again. Things that we had largely taken dominion over, with guns and fire and electricity and extinction. But the fear remained. We chanced upon a state rest stop. It was a mere pull-off parallel to the highway, with a couple of 55-gallon drums and a picnic table or two. Grandpa pulled over. "This'll do just fine," he said. "What are we doing?" I asked. "Pulling off for the night. You can sleep in the back seat. Could bundle up a towel for a pillow. I got a blanket in the trunk." "But why? What was wrong with the motel?" "They didn't have any ice," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. He yawned like a cartoon character, stretched his arms as far as he could. "Look, little buddy, we better hit the hay while we can. Got a lot more miles to cover tomorrow. I'll be fine sleeping up front." That was that. I sulked and curled down low in the back seat until sleep took hold. I awoke to birdsong in the morning, shafts of sunlight shining through the trees. My jeans were balled up on the floor, and for a moment I thought I'd pissed myself, but it was just my briefs soaked with the sweat from sleeping in a vehicle on a humid summer night. Grandpa wasn't in the front seat. I shimmied into my jeans and stepped outside. He was sitting on one of the picnic tables. "Morning, sunshine," Grandpa said, acting like I had just emerged in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while he manned the waffle maker, ignoring the fact we were on the side of the road after fleeing into the night. Still half asleep, I grumbled a response. The surroundings and circumstance disoriented me. "Reckon we better head on down the road a bit and find us a bite to eat?" he asked. "I guess," I said. "Look, why did we sleep on the side of the road? What was all of that about, with leaving the motel? My neck hurts from sleeping in the back." He sighed. "It's a long story, son. I don't really want to get into it right now. We'll just make sure that every hotel has an ice machine from here on out, okay? No more sleeping on the side of the roads. I'll tell you someday when you're older." And he did tell me when I was older, but not until I was much older. Not until that night we fled the motel was a distant memory. Not until he had passed away. I wasn't close to him when I was forced to take upon that venture, that quest across the southeastern United States where we scoured graveyards for proof of lives once lived, links in the chain. Yet that trip brought us closer together, and we would grow even closer still, him becoming a father figure. After the divorce, my mom would move us out to his town 3 hours away, where I would stay until I graduated high school. I made it to my 30s before he got sick. As a smoker that hadn't quit until later in life, he had a pretty good run before something related to that got to him. In his case, it was lung cancer. They thought they'd caught it early enough that they liked his chances if he did chemo. He was in his 70s and still seemed as full of life as ever, like he could get a decade or more if he beat it. However, he was reluctant to start the treatment. "I'm only doing this because your mom wants me to fight it or whatever. I'd just take my chances if it was up to me. I feel about done, like I'm ready to go see your grandma," he told me. I was married and out of state at this point, making trips home when I could because I was worried the end could be near, and you never really know. The treatment for his cancer had been a series of forward steps and backward slides, all amounting to little more than tires spinning in the mud. It was near the end of his life when I received an email from him. This came as a surprise, as he seldom sent emails. He'd always been resistant to newfangled technology, finally acquiescing to us purchasing him a tablet with a keyboard. I'm lucky I received his email when I did. By the time I finished it, I told my work there was an emergency, hopped in my car, and urgently drove back to my grandfather's hometown. "Daniel, I guess I've got to get this out somehow, and you're the only one that would really understand. You may remember that summer trip we took back when your folks were having problems, back before they split up? Remember that night we slept in the car because the motel ice machine was broken? I remember that trip clearly. Most days I was still sad and angry over your grandmother being gone. I didn't do much of the things I used to. I didn't go to church or fish or go to breakfast on the weekends. I just work and come home and sit around that empty house. So it was good for you to come out on that trip with me. Got me out of a funk, I suppose. I know I ain't the most outgoing sort of fella. Never been to show how I feel very much, but I was glad you were there. Now, what I'm about to tell you, I would have never taken you along if I didn't think it would be safe. It had been years, decades even, since these events took place. Your grandma and I had traveled tons of times after, and as long as I did what I was supposed to, I was fine. It had been a few years since we'd gotten back from the war, and we'd settled into our lives back home. College was never in the works for me, so my GI Bill was never used. I hadn't proposed to your grandmother yet, but we were in the courtship phase. Shane Albright had served over there with me. He came to tell me about some work with the U.S. Forest Service. Said there were hiring preferences for veterans on account of it being a government job and all. So we both signed on and got jobs with the Fire Watch. They had us working near our hometown at first, but soon they shuffled us around, doing month-long stints at sites across state lines. These out-of-town gigs paid a little more. We'd ride out together in Shane's Studebaker Champion, where we would arrive at the site and be stationed at separate towers, staring out across the rolling forests as we looked for fires. Then we were off for 2 weeks before we'd go back and do it again. It was solitary work. I sometimes wonder if working that job made me quieter than I already was. I got in the habit of journaling, writing letters to the gal that would become your grandma. Little love poems she kept in an envelope. They're buried under the earth with her. Sometimes it would take us a 2-day drive out to these towers. We'd end up staying overnight somewhere along the way. Other times we'd get off on that Sunday and drive all the way through, taking shifts behind the wheel, collapsing back at home in piles of pure exhaustion with little memory of how we got there. It was on one of these overnights when we heard it, the broadcast. I was driving, and the AM radio was going, when suddenly a lady with the voice of an angel sang "Anchors Aweigh." Shane was half asleep in the passenger seat but started singing along to it. There was a burst of static and the sounds of explosions, the howl of klaxons and the shots of an ack-ack gun, and someone whistling happily through it all. Then there was a masculine voice, a cheerful voice. He introduced himself as Buck Hensley and started rambling about the pilot of the Enola Gay and how he never lost a wink of sleep even after what he'd done. Vaporized all those men, women, and children, and babies of Hiroshima. Said that maybe nuking a city worked better than a nightcap or a glass of warm milk as far as a sleep remedy. He said that he found the whole thing hilarious and pitiful from the outside looking in, especially knowing what he knew now. Now at this point, Shane was sitting straight up in his seat. We were both enraptured by what we were hearing. The man on the radio then presented us with something he called the rules of the road. The rule was this: if we were to stop at a motel or hotel at any point during our journey, then we were to request ice for our room from the innkeepers. He said there might even be an ice machine on the premises, that they would one day be all the rage at lodgings in the future. And he was right, but that's beside the point. It would be clear that there was something uncanny about the guy on the radio well before his prediction came true. The consequences of not following this rule seemed vague. He said something about a visitor in the night that would give us cold feet. The man on the radio, Buck Hensley, he bid us a fond farewell and safe travels, and just like that, the radio went back to normal. To cut to the chase, we were on the road once again, driving out to a job. We had stopped off at some roadside motel, not unlike the many you and I stayed at during our cemetery trip, just newer and less worse for wear. It was late when we stopped. There wasn't a TV in the room. Those were luxury items at that point, only a radio on the dresser. I remembered the warning. "You really gonna do that?" Shane asked me. "Sure. Why not? Well, the ice ain't free. I could use me a cold drink." They gave me a small ice bucket at the motel office. It cost 5 cents. "Well, if you've got it, might as well make the most of it," Shane said, and pulled a pint of rye whiskey from his bag. He had a drink, and I had one as well. Bet you didn't know your old pops had it in him. That was then, though. I put aside all of that tomfoolery once your mom was born. So that's how we all survived our first night at a motel after hearing that fateful rule. We rode off to our job site for another couple weeks of fire watching and isolation. There was a late departure, and we found ourselves bone-tired and miles from home. Even if we'd pulled it together and drove in shifts, we wouldn't have gotten back home until noon. Shane asked, "Why not take it easy and stop for a bite? Maybe get a drink?" There was a little town with a diner and a motel and a filling station. We had burgers and sodas and fries at the diner. It was getting late by the time we got into our room, and I wanted nothing more than to fall asleep. Shane had other ideas, though. He had eyed a pool hall off the main drag and wanted to go, begging me to come along with him. I shrugged and followed along. We played some pool and drank some beers. As the night rolled on, Shane got cozy with a gal in a corner booth. I was on the sideline and getting bored. I made a signal to Shane that I'd be leaving. He pulled me aside. "Look, pal, I play my cards right, we might find ourselves back at the room," he said with a wink. "Just wanted to give you a heads up." I just sighed and told him good luck, and when I got to the room, I realized we only had a single bed. Being in the military, it was nothing for us to sleep in proximity like this. However, if he brought a girl back to the room, that might have made things complicated. I didn't really want to be in there, even if there were 2 beds. It was decision time, and as welcoming as the bed looked to my drunk and tired body, I took one for the team. I made my way to the car and fell asleep in the back seat of the Studebaker. The sleep was light and fitful. I tossed and turned in and out of a half-awake doze, my thoughts growing more agitated at my sleeping situation, when all of a sudden it hit me. The ice. We'd forgotten the ice. I shot up and opened the door. I didn't know what time it was. It was still dark out. The parking lot was silent. I started for the motel room door. My hand was almost to the knob when the door creaked open and someone stepped out. Was it the same gal from the bar? She looked different in the orange motel lights, like her skin was paler. Her eyes were the bluest things I'd ever seen, glowing almost. She smiled at me, and her lips looked like they had a layer of frost on them. "Care for a turn? Your buddy's tuckered out," she said. That's when I noticed her blouse was unbuttoned. I could see her chest and the sides of her breasts, the heart beating under her translucent skin, her lungs inflating with each breath. Her skin was glass. No, not glass. Ice. I staggered backwards into the parking lot, tripping over my own 2 feet and landing back hard on my hands and rear end. I could hear the lady laughing, the laughter fading into the night. I got up to my feet, and she was gone. I rushed into our motel room and flicked on the lights. That's where I found Shane, lying naked on the bed, eyes closed and face all contorted. He wasn't moving a muscle. His back was arched and rigid, while his neck was extended as far back as it could reach, with the crown of his head touching the mattress. His heels were planted firmly at the other end, with toes curled. "Shane, buddy? You okay?" I asked, and instantly felt stupid. Of course, there was no response. He didn't move to my touch and felt stiff, like rigor mortis had set in. But I wasn't an expert in such things, and it didn't seem to explain the fact that his body felt ice cold. I also couldn't ignore the fact that his back wasn't the only thing rigid. It almost looked like he had died mid-thrust, frozen in place. His now permanent facial expression could have been one of pleasure or pain. The tips of various extremities looked black. Frostbite. I tossed a sheet over his lower half and went to the motel office to call the authorities. There was no definitive cause of death, no mention of hypothermia. I wondered if he thawed or something like that by the time they got there. They wondered if a black widow spider had bitten him. It could cause muscle spasms like that, they said. I told them I'd seen a woman leave the room. There'd been no signs of foul play. Maybe he had been poisoned? I didn't tell them that this was all because he'd paid the price for not following a rule we had heard about on a mysterious broadcast. I didn't tell them that the woman's skin was ice, and you could see her heart in her chest, pumping the blue blood through her veins. I've lived with this all these years. My life has been no different. The world keeps spinning and largely seems to play by the natural rules I've known all my life. The only thing that's changed is the simple inconvenience whenever I travel. Your grandmother used to make fun of me about the ice machine habit, and I told her a version of this story with the crazier stuff taken out. I told her I do it as an homage to my old buddy Shane, gone too soon from this world, taken in a manner too strange to grieve. You're the only one I've told the entire story to, and here's why. I've had the feeling over the past few months that things haven't been right. I have a cough that's more than a smoker's cough, a cough I can't quite shake, a heaviness in my chest. Last week, the doctor took an X-ray and confirmed it, a mass in my lungs. He said it looked inoperable and offered chemo. Well, I know where I stand on that. I'm going to go out on my own terms. Not going to wait until the cancer spreads everywhere, getting a little worse each day. I'm also not going to poison myself with no chemo. I'm sitting in a little motel called the Relax Inn out by the interstate. You know the one. It's right across the parking lot from the Blue Ribbon Diner we used to always go to. After I finish this letter, I'm going to sit back and watch a little TV, smoke my first cigarette in 5 years, and go to sleep. What I won't do is fill the ice bucket. I'll ignore the rule, and I'll wait for her to come to me in the dark. It seems like a good way to go out, as good as any. One final kick of pleasure before I kick the bucket. The motel bed sure beats a hospital bed. I hope you understand. Love, Grandpa Doug. P.S. I hate to put you out like this or worry you, but it's better this way. You're welcome to contact the authorities for a wellness check. I'd hate for you to find my body in the gruesome and bizarre state it will be in. I'm in room 127. It took me about 2 hours to arrive at the Relax Inn. I mulled the story over and over in my head the whole way over, finding it harder and harder to believe. Still, there were other ways he could kill himself. I'd seen the bottles of morphine tablets they'd prescribed him, the ones his stoic ass seldom took. Grandpa's burgundy Mercury Sable was parked outside room 127. Faded Navy veteran bumper sticker in the corner of the rear window. Dread coated my stomach, and the Old Spice I'd put on earlier that day was no match for the anxiety-soured sweat now coating my armpits. I contemplated picking up my phone and calling the authorities, but there was a decision I'd made on my way over here. I was going to enter the room. I had to see for myself. I had to see him one last time. Fearing the door would be locked and that I'd have to regroup, I approached the door with trepidation. He had left the key in the door. I reached to turn the key, paused. Was I really going to do this? To see my grandpa dead like this? Body rigid and frostbitten? His elderly icicle erection tenting the bedsheet? Did I even believe his story? It was impossible. Mr. Freeze was from the comic books. People didn't just freeze solid in motel beds. I took a deep breath and went inside. A Western played on the muted TV. A bucket sat on the middle of the dresser, and my Grandpa Doug lay in the middle of the bed, curled on his side. The water in the ice bucket was still cold, and his body was still warm. But there was no heartbeat, no breaths. His half-lidded eyes stared into nothingness, and his pupils didn't respond to my phone's flashlight. On the nightstand sat an empty prescription bottle and a note. This is what it said. Of course, I couldn't go through with it. I'm writing this postscript hours before I tune out. Even now, I still think about it, how it would be a great way to go out. Yet maybe I'm scared. Scared of the lady with the frigid lips and the icy skin. How it would feel to die that way. But I don't think that's it. I think it's because of your grandma. After she died, I never had another woman. How could I see her in heaven with that as my final act? Even though I got ripped off and have missed her every day, she was enough for a lifetime. I can wait just a little while longer. So, we end up back where we started. Me at a cemetery with Grandpa. Except this time, he's underground, and it's his headstone I'm thinking of rubbing, the one he shares with my grandmother. I don't go through with it, though. The act seems better suited to the older graves of faceless ancestors, and he was anything but. He was my grandfather, a man I loved and knew. I'll carry him around in different ways. The quiet demeanor that I exhibit, the way I furrow my brow when lost in thought, the penchant for a good Western, and the bucket of ice I will fill at every overnight motel I find myself in. Aha! Don't you love the sense of closure when a story ends more or less where it began? And aren't we all a bit richer for the journey? Speaking for myself, I'm certainly feeling a bit cooler, if nothing else. In the heat of summer, my ice has been reduced to slush at the bottom of a sweaty glass. I certainly hope that will suffice to keep me safe. Did you know that this story ties into a larger universe the author is still working on? You recall the mysterious late-night broadcast in the car, right? I certainly got a warm, familiar feeling at the mention of a midnight broadcast. Never mind that nastiness about the nukes. The broadcast outlined some rules of the road, which happens to be the title of the author's most famous series, and a book by the same name. I'll show the cover on screen now, and you can find a link to snag a copy in the description. Ho-ho! It looks like the audiobook was performed by some of our narrator friends. How wonderful! If you enjoyed this story, please check out CB's book in the links below. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe to hear more tales like this one. Whatever you do, stay frosty, but not too frosty. And don't fall asleep.